Hey everybody, welcome to week, 15? This is 4C, Development of the Ideas of Biological Evolution. We're really going to be talking a lot about Darwin, and what we're interested in making sure you understand this week is what evidence Darwin had, and then what evidence do we have now that we can study cells and we can study genetics. What evidence do you have available for understanding how organisms have changed over millions of years, and how the environment pushes organisms to change, and how organisms have common ancestry. So this guy right here, trying to move out of your way, this is Charles Darwin. Charles Darwin was an English scientist in the 1800s, kind of like Mendel, a little more connected to the scientific community. He is actually often considered the father of evolution, and I know that part of the interesting aspect of his story is that he didn't necessarily want to publish his ideas. He was still very contemplative when it came to formulating a really formal explanation of what he had gathered all this evidence over his life's work and what he had put into on the origin of species. And really, it was very competitive scientific community at that time. And so it came out that some other scientists were gonna put some ideas out there, and he was like, I think I have this explanation down. And so he published On the Origin of Species, proposing what he had gathered evidence on, which was basically that organisms were selected for through their environment where they lived, and what they interacted with, basically because of their characteristics, and certain ones would survive, thrive, and reproduce. And that led to this concept of the survival of the fittest, right? But that's basically his explanation, is what we know now to be true as the mechanism of evolution, that he had this idea without understanding what was taking place on a cellular level. He didn't know about meiosis. He didn't understand the increase in variety through mutation. He didn't have any of that. He was just making observations by traveling as a naturalist, studying nature, drawing, taking copious notes on species that he was collecting. He was collecting species samples, and just, this big living museum as he traveled the world on a boat, as he sailed around the world, just basically as a companion to someone on a ship. But he changed the course of history with his observations. I mean, really, Mendel is the same kind of inquisitive mind, taking notes and making those comparisons. It's a pretty impressive feat. So that's Charles Darwin. And this is our kind of beginning of this road here. So Charles Darwin didn't have the evidence that we have. He didn't have this understanding of chromosomes and how there was mutations that could just show up in a genome. So really, he was limited in the evidence that he had access to, and that helped him understand what was taking place. He had fossil evidence. Fossils were a big part of the scientific collection at the time. There were museums and curators in those museums that would catalog fossils and study fossils, and fossils were fascinating to the scientific community because there was direct evidence that life was very different long ago, and that there was kind of like this timeline of changes. So you could see the this chart on the left-hand side of the screen. This is referred to as geologic time, basically tracking back through the layers of the Earth. You see evidence that fossils would accumulate in particular layers, and then there'd be another layer, and the fossils that were concentrated in that layer would be different. And this was evidence that life had been changing basically since life showed up, that life has been changing. Fossils are traces of life that's left behind on Earth, and oftentimes that's going to look kind of like this, like it's the hard parts of organisms that are left behind. And so sometimes it's hard for us to really get a full picture of what's going on, since most of the time all the soft tissues are going to decay away. But every once in a while we get lucky and we get a really large deposit of soft tissue that's preserved as well. Despite the limitations of the fossil record, yes, there are holes. It is a very complete picture. Like when you take the whole thing, there's a lot of evidence, and it shows over time how organisms have changed, how species have evolved, how communities of species have changed, how climate has changed, and how we're basically living on a different Earth. One of the tools that scientists use to organize fossils and organize this evidence is referred to as a cladogram, and this is part of a study called phylogeny, basically looking at how organisms are related to organisms that have preceded them, looking at common ancestry, and kind of each time one of these branches juts off of the main line here, it's indicating there was some kind of large, what we know now to be some mutation that led to a development in a totally different direction. What we know now is that these branches, as they began to split off, probably indicate that there was some kind of isolation that happened somewhere in here, where a species was, moved, a large group of species moved out into different areas and then began to really branch off from that common ancestor. So one of the interesting fossils here, this Archaeopteryx, is much like its lizard-type dinosaur ancestors, but it has feathers. And it's that characteristic that has been a piece of evidence tying birds to a common ancestor with crocodiles. So, all that to say that was the extent of Darwin's evidence. It wasn't based on chromosomes. It was based on these direct observations and fossil evidence. One thing to remember is when you look at that concept of geologic time and the large repository of fossil evidence, that it is an indication that most of the species that are alive on Earth were not alive at some point, and the species that were living in the past epochs and periods are no longer living. We do have some very ancient examples, like the shark and the crocodile, but other than that, what we have is evidence that organisms have changed over time, and that there has to be some kind of mechanism for that change. I'm going to scoot out of the way. I want to make sure that you take the time to watch that video, but I don't want to take it up on the screencast. So we're going to go ahead and skip over this, but I want you to go back and watch that video. You can find the link in the presentation, and it'll play for you there. All right, so one of the other pieces of evidence that Darwin did have available was this concept of biogeography. So this would be the study of where organisms exist and how that distribution relates to, like maybe there's like from one continent to the other, and how they've been distributed in different places throughout the world. And what this display is showing is where marsupials are actually located and where they actually thrive. So there's, when you talk about live birth and mammals, we have placental mammals, and then we have marsupials, and marsupials carry a very rudimentary fetus that's been very underdeveloped in a pouch. I know that you probably learned a little bit about kangaroos. What you might not know is that we have one marsupial in Northern not Northern California. Yes, Northern California, but in North America. And so one of these, what's important about this, though, is looking at how marsupials had a common ancestor at one point, and then there's been a distribution of this type of mammal throughout the world, and there's evidence involved in that, like where there's fossil evidence of marsupials that look more closely related as well. So this concept of biogeography kind of goes along with fossil evidence, especially when we're studying like how fossils are distributed. But it's looking at those similarities worldwide and taking a look at how those traits are distributed. One of the concepts of biogeography, looking at these patterns of how species are distributed, is taking a look at the island effect. And what we see with islands is that islands actually lead to some extremely unique characteristics showing up in species. And this is kind of what Darwin was famous for. He went to the Galapagos Islands. So you see, this is South America, this is Ecuador, and off of the coast of Ecuador over here are the Galapagos Islands. And this is a place where Darwin's boat, the HMS Beagle, went, and he went and studied organisms on each of these islands and really began to make some connections about how organisms on the mainland probably gave way to the characteristics and the organisms as an ancestor that were living out on these islands. So somehow there was a connection, and he began to see that evidenced in those species. And so one thing that we know, we really got to think about this like island concept, is that isolation will lead to a really unique species because there's no way to share the genes with, you have like one species, and then there's a big, ocean that begins to open up between you. Like the species on one side of the ocean and the species on the other side of the ocean, they can no longer interbreed, so there's no sharing of those genetic traits. We understand that now. Darwin didn't understand that there was like a gene pool that was shifting, but what he did see was evidence of that taking place. And so places like Madagascar, Tasmania, the Galapagos Islands, Hawaii, like islands have really, really unique species, and that is a piece of evidence that Darwin was looking at. That biogeography is part of that study. So I'm like at 14 minutes, and the way I have this set up, it's a 15-minute limit to the lecture, so this is going to have to be part 1, and then you're going to have to open up part 2 in order to finish. So I'll sign off, and then you can pick up on part 2.